I'm chairing this. My great friend and colleague John Hamilton is doing most of the talking. We aren't putting up any numbers, which are in the report. What we are doing is having a conversation about it, the new Egyptian Power Report 2021. It has power in it in all its contexts, focused on the electricity industry, but we also go into details of politics and economics as well, all of which we'll be talking about on this on this webinar. In fact, funnily enough, I was thinking just before we started that the last time I did a podcast on the subject of Egypt, almost sure was back in 2011. And we actually did the podcast. I did it with Chatham House, and we were in Cairo, and we did a podcast talking about developments in that extraordinary year, sitting on the Cairo metro, and then coming up the stairs of Tahrir Square, where there was still extreme amount of life going on. So it's a long history. For those just joining, I'm John Marks. I'm chairman of Cross Border Information, a North Africa watcher of too many decades now. Talking to John Hamilton, managing director of Cross Border Information, also a North Africa watcher of an increasing number of decades. I can remember when John went to live on a houseboat on the Nile while he was learning Arabic in Cairo. So we've been here for quite a long time looking at this, and it's still exciting. It's still interesting. There are a lot of themes to tease out. So basically, John, we've produced a long and substantial report on Egypt, its electricity supply industry, its economy, policy issues, politics. Actually, why have we done it? Where are we coming from in our coverage of Egypt?
Well, as you said, we've been looking at it for a long time, but I think it's important to say we look at Egypt, and in fact, most of the other countries that we focus on across all of Africa in a variety of different ways. And so I think it's given us the opportunity to put together a report which isn't just another sort of cut and paste sort of management report. I think we can do something quite different. We've, as I think as many people on the call will know, we have our regular coverage of the markets in our newsletter, African Energy. So we're looking all the time at what's happening in a lot of detail. We've got our database, African Energy Live Data. So we've got huge amounts of granular detail about all the projects and the pipeline. And so we can put all those things together, and we've got our correspondents on our teams who help us do that. But it's not only that. Of course, we've also we do monitoring on Egypt, which isn't just focused on energy and power. I mean, we're looking at it for other people on a more sort of purely sort of political or economic basis. We get asked very frequently in the other part of our business to do strategic advisory and sort of due diligence. So we're looking all the time and using different people and different teams to help us. So we've got a lot to say about Egypt, and let's say we can put together a report, and I think we have done, which isn't just presenting all the data, all the facts. We're making arguments and coming to conclusions and testing those arguments and conclusions and testing them all the time. So so I think we've put together something which is of, I hope, of value. And if we haven't got every argument or conclusion right, I think we're ready to debate them, and I think that's a useful process too.
Certainly debating. Some of the things that we say are controversial. I think those of you that see African Energy, we did an AEView leader a couple of issues ago based on some of the thoughts from the report, which were quite trenchant actually in the looking at the excitability around the power industry, but also the amount of funding going in and how that chimed with the political situation in the country. So we've certainly been looking at it. We thought when we do this webinar, we'd have a conversation. We thought we'd start with the granularity and then push outwards. So we'll finish with the politics and economics. But clearly, when you're looking at the electricity supply industry in Egypt, you've got this extraordinary amount of gas, all the excitement after all that came around the export LNG prospects as well as Horfield and other resources. But you've also got a remarkable renewables resource that really has taken off. Awful lot of wind, awful lot of solar, to a degree that when we were having a separate discussion on appropriate technologies for African economies earlier in the week, Egypt definitely came out amongst the not many countries where, for example, you could look at really significant hydrogen applications. So there's been a tremendous amount of enthusiasm around this, John, as you know better than anyone. But actually, is Egypt in a situation where it's actually had too much? Can you have too much success? You know, there's an awful lot of power. There's an awful lot of gas, big turbines. There's an awful lot of renewables. Actually, can the market take it? Population of 100 million, but can the country actually consume that much?
Well, I was looking before we started. I had checked on our platform live data about what they've actually got, and what there is now operating in the country is 59.5 gigawatts of power, half of which was added since 2015.
Remarkable figure.
Remarkable. Most of that gas, and I think peak demand right now is 31 gigawatts. So they've almost got twice as much, and even allowing for sort of the intermittency of the the growing amount of renewables, but it's still small. You look at that and just say, yes, they've got too much. But I think there's a big but here, which is when you start looking more closely at the market, I think there's lots of reasons to thinking that that situation A will change, and B that there's the market is not a monolith. There's areas which are already open and other areas which are going to open in the future. So it's not simply a question of saying it's the market's dead and there's nothing to be done for a good long time. And I can go on and make a few sort of specific comments. I want to talk about supply. I want to talk about the market, and I also want to talk a bit about what's going to happen in demand. And I'll start with the question of supply, because you can look. Anyone can go and look at it. They're the Egyptians are very good at putting out their data, and quite a lot of that install capacity. A section of it isn't being used very much. The capacity factors are pretty low, and part of the reason for that is that it's incredibly inefficient. And one of the things you can do, and we have done, is just go through and you look at all the plants. 6 gigawatts of power commissioned in the 1980s, another nearly 4 gigawatts commissioned in the 1990s. It's not really a question of sort of if, but really sort of when they get rid of that. And you said we're going to talk about the politics at the end. In my view, this is why the politics around Egypt is so important, because they haven't said anything about what they're really going to do with that sort of old capacity that they could get rid of. And dealing with it it's more of a political question. And when they decide to do that, and when they decide to take that capacity away, that's a decision which has to be taken at probably quite a high level. So there's that. And then you've also got the question of what else is going to come on. And there's a very interesting project we're looking at, which is another gas project. Amazingly, that they want to actually, they're supposed to start building it this year. It's Aqua's Luxor project, 2.25 gigawatts, supposed to come online by 2023, 2024. Are they going to start building that this year? Do they really want to do that? To be honest, we don't know. And an even bigger question, the Daba nuclear plant, still waiting for its construction license. Very secretive, it's very hard to tell what's going on with that. But here's a political context to look at the nuclear plant in. Ultimately, they're looking at 4.8 gigawatts, but one unit, 1.2 gigawatts. You can look at it from a sort of power point of view or the market, but I think the really important point of perspective for Daba is the question of the president. Who is going to be the man who ushers Egypt into the nuclear age? It's going to be President Sisi. He's can now stay in power until 2030. So the minimum requirement for that nuclear plant is you get one unit on by 2029, 2030. That's the requirement. That's the political requirement. It's got to happen by then. It doesn't really have to happen before then. So there's flexibility and I think a pragmatic approach. You can begin to see how the market is. I mean, it's still crowded, but it's perhaps not as crowded on the supply side as the initial figures and the pipeline show. Yeah. And then you have.
I was just going to say, within this framework, do you want to, an interesting point you made about Daba and the nuclear project, because clearly Egypt at present has, as so often in its very long past, has a real appetite from the very senior leadership for very large projects, be they new capitals, be they Suez canals, be they nuclear plants. But how, within the balance, how are you seeing the upstream gas industry, what it can feed to domestic consumption, and actually the position on the gas at the moment?
Well, I think that Egypt's gas is incredibly difficult to predict with any level of certainty, because you've got a whole series of unknowns. There's, an important unknown, which I think people are just beginning to sort of get their heads around right now, is the fact that some of that deep water offshore gas fields, some of those fields are declining way more rapidly than was expected, and so fields which were expected to produce for several years ahead have almost reached the end of their life. And there's the new Raven development which is coming on, and there's a question about how long that might last. But is this a question of field dynamics and something fundamental, or is there an element of the way the fields have been managed? Once again, quite a sensitive and political question, and one that I don't think there's any definitive answer to. So in terms of existing production, it's and how long that will sustain for, it's not all that clear. And then you've got this huge new exploration program which they've embarked on in the west, the far west of the Nile Delta, and there's a lot of major companies have come in and started exploration. There's high hopes, but that's it's a classic, isn't it? I mean, we've seen it. You saw that sort of similar excitement about the Atlantic margin off Morocco, with a lot of majors going in there, and it didn't work. So
absolutely,
very difficult to say. There may be vast amounts of gas in the future, or maybe very, very little. So they've been sort of hedging their bets a bit, I suppose. They're buying gas from Israel already coming in, planning a new pipeline. come in. But the commercial future of these deals is, I mean, it's not a question of criticizing or saying that they're doing the wrong thing. It's basically, I mean, if you're in the position of the Egyptian authorities, it's very difficult to know what the right thing is to do. I mean, should they be importing gas from Israel and even Cyprus in the future, or should they be expecting that they'll have their own reserves and focusing on that? I sometimes think probably what they're just saying is, let the future look after itself. The commercialities of these things are impossible to predict. But if we build the infrastructure, we can become a hub and the energy hub. And we're just going to invest in that idea. And once we've become the hub, then we're the hub. And basically, the question of who's making money out of the gas or where it's going or coming from, we'll just leave that, to the future, which you could say is probably the sort of attitude which maybe they took when they built the Damietta plant back in the beginning of the 2000s. And look what happened to that. It had to spend 8 years not functioning. But maybe these are the kind of risks which they're prepared to take.
Build and they will come.
Perhaps, but there's a really important point. This is absolutely related to the prospects for the power market in Egypt, because this is something we wrote about in African Energy several issues ago, and it's now coming up again. Is the question of electric power exports, because when you look at really where Egypt could succeed, and I'm not saying this is easy. It's not in exporting gas; it's exporting power, and so a strategy of using gas wherever it's coming from, whether it's domestic or coming from Israel, processing that gas. Of course, they've got a huge petrochemicals development program going on, but using gas to generate power and exporting it to across the region is perhaps a way out of the conundrum, because it's something which they can control perhaps a bit more easily. Trouble these things, one difficulty succeeds another. Maybe they can export it to Iraq, to down into Sudan, and they've got their sort of interconnections already, and they're going to invest more in the grid interconnections. But we're really talking about HVDC lines, and they need the cost of the cables to come down. But if they want to send electric power to Europe, it's got to be renewables. I don't think the European Union is going to buy power generated by gas in Egypt. They buy renewable power generated in Egypt, and maybe there's a scheme, as we all know, the X-Link scheme, to send power from Morocco up to the UK. So they're not the only person thinking about this, and of course you've got Tunor in Tunisia, but it's going to be renewable power. So there's a lot of elements there to think about. But
we'll come back if you don't mind, John. We'll come back in a bit to the question of exports, regional transmission grids, the fact, the competition that there'll be for exports, and the question with the gas, do you export it as molecules or electrons, or do you leave those electrons within Egypt for use? We'll come back to, just as we're still in a relatively early stages of this conversation. I think what would be very good, if you don't mind, would be to come and look at the impacts of cheap wind and solar. I mean, few countries on the African continent have sucked in so much money for their undoubted wind and solar potential, where you've got both, which of course is great in balancing that grid, where people will be looking for gas to be balancing the grid as well. So where do you see the wind and solar industry at this moment, actually in the scale that it is for people who may be coming on this webinar who don't follow it in great detail, but also more specifically in terms of where it is in policy terms, how it fits into the mix, and possibly where do we think it's going? You know, the dynamics around.
Well, I think we're at a kind of inflection point. This was a term we used when we were actually presenting the live data numbers a couple of days ago. Very little solar was tiny amount was built in Egypt just in 2020, and you've got different views coming out now about what is happening here with this policy that the government has instituted and spoken about. In the media, it's kind of the numbers have all been rounded down, and they're now saying it's 2 cents for solar, 3 cents for wind. And so the government message is, if you can build us power, and sell it, at those prices, you can do it. We've been hearing for a long time from people in the industry just saying this isn't possible. And of course, there are companies going ahead, Aqua's going ahead, Amea's going ahead, but it's definitely these prices have I think made life, they've surprised and challenged people in the industry. They're saying this isn't possible, but that at the same time, I've had other people in the industry saying that the challenge is actually it's a slightly different one. It's not that this isn't possible. It's that in a way it's all too possible that these prices are so competitive. They're a threat to the established interests within Egyptian Electricity Holding Company, the state-owned gas-fired generation, which is now more, although it's subsidized, is more expensive than the sort of private sector wind and solar that's coming to challenge it, and so therefore that the government has put the brakes on. Stepping back from that, you could you could say, well, they can't. Not everyone can be right in that argument, but actually, in a funny way, I think within a certain context, everybody can be right, because not everybody sees the market in the same way. And what we're talking about isn't just a black and white question of it's like this or it's not. It's a question of market perceptions, isn't it? Everyone has a right to their own view of the market. And I think this is why we're at this inflection point. I think everybody's, making up their minds. And I think what's necessary, really, I think, is to see over the next period, some important decisions being taken by the Egyptian government. I mean, if they're serious about wanting to have more private sector power at those prices, I think they, to go back to what I was talking about before, they do have to start shutting some of their older, less efficient production. They have to take that decision. Some of that inefficient gas production, they've got to mothball it or shut it down and make it plain that's happened. And then there's other sort of market developments which they're thinking about.
I was just going to say that North Africa's right the way across from the Maghreb, right the way through Egypt. Their favourite word has always been reform in whatever sense, and Egypt still has some reform. I mean, there's talk of unbundling, that there would be wheeling allowed. How do you see those dynamics, the sort of the political attitude? You've got a government that's can be very conservative, very authoritarian. Is it actually going to be moving towards opening up the sector, if we look at it, first of all, specifically in the electricity supply industry context?
Well, they've postponed the formal unbundling of the Egyptian Electricity Transition Company from the holding company for, I think, 3 years, really because of COVID. But I wouldn't take that as an indication of that they're sort of losing their commitment to this direction. I mean, the fact is the impact of COVID, and we'll probably talk a bit about this sort of a bit later on. I mean, it has, was severe, and they've done pretty well, but they've had to I think to slow down a bit the subsidy reform, and and their ability to sort of unravel the problems of debt within the state utility have definitely been impacted. So they've given themselves a bit more time, but I think they're certainly continuing in that direction. They're the net metering is already working, and although I mean the projects, most of them are pretty tiny, but there's some slightly larger ones. I mean, what they do show is that even within this sort of oversupplied system, there's a space for private sector projects, even if it's just helping sort of more remote locations on the Red Sea and the Mediterranean to get power where where they don't have access. So the idea that at some point in the future, I don't know how far in the future, but within a it's being planned and looked at, the idea that they will allow wheeling to allow corporate PPAs, I think is a genuine expectation, and that will that will certainly change the market. The broader political context, though, I think there are two things to mention. First of all, although it seems a very long time ago in some ways, the government hasn't forgotten what happened in 2012, those blackouts, and that's one of the reasons why they want so much of a reserve margin. They're not going to let that happen again under any circumstances.
What's the current reserve margin, would you say, John?
Well, I mean, if you're counting every single megawatt that they've got installed, and most of it is available, even if it's not always being used, I can't remember what the precise percentage was. I think it's on like 96% or something. I mean,
I know we had a figure that was exceptionally high.
Exceptionally high.
Which does bring us on to the demand question, more or less, doesn't it? Because we've been talking about supply.
Yes.
Within this context. I mean, it was last year, wasn't it, that little girl was born who was the 100 millionth Egyptian. So we're talking about a very large population, a population where you would hope that living standards increase very significantly. A country with very strong industrial ambitions that come from the very top, but also Egyptian industry. We know a tremendous amount of respect. Looking at wider Africa, you're seeing some of Egypt's best companies operating there. That does build up a demand picture. So I suppose the first question is, to what degree can we see that domestic demand, as opposed to export demand, really takes off, requiring a really significant changes in the industry? And then possibly from that going on and saying, well, how do you see the Egyptian business environment accommodating that? Because clearly there's prospects for private investment at various levels, commercial and industrial, for example, as well as from independent power projects with PPAs.
Yes, well, I mean, we spent a lot of time, in the sort of supply demand outlook of the report, sort of wrestling with these questions, because I mean, one thing which we certainly hear is that the Egyptian authorities are fairly confident about this. They think that demand is going to increase and that they're going to need this power. But then if you just take a really sort of plain vanilla look at the sort of trends for growth and population growth, and suppose that the power demand is sort of going to increase sort of in line with that, it's not enough. Although what people I think talk about a bit, and it's still something we've got to see. I mean, it's an idea. It's not something which I can present any data to say this is actually happening, is the idea that the emerging middle class, that there is actually going to be more power consumption. So it's not just that. So it's not just that growth is going to increase and there are going to be more Egyptians, which of course there are. It's also that they're going to be using more power.
Absolutely.
In their homes. I think that's the vital thing, and that business is going to be using more power. And they certainly, in the Suez Canal zone, they're expecting to have a sort of massive economic development there. And I think real estate is a vital element of this. I think the extent to which the government is pinning its sort of economic hopes on the potential to sort of leverage real estate development to sort of bootstrap the whole economy and sort of create a new sort of prosperous middle class. I mean, it can't be underestimated. And whether you're looking at the new administrative capital or the new El Alamein, and all the things they're planning to do, they have a vision of Egypt which is very different from the Egypt of today. And I think they're going to need the power.
We had, if on this, John, while we're going on, there was a couple of questions that came in that have caught my attention. One from Rizvan Ahmed, who was asking what challenges do we see to the captive C&I, commercial and industrial solar market in Egypt, which I think is very pertinent towards this because clearly there's the industrial use. And then Carsten Dummermuth from Man Energy Solutions in Germany was asking, do we see any business opportunities for smaller scale IPP sort of LNG to power in the sort of 50 to 200 megawatt capacity that again one might see in some markets? How would those issues fit in?
Well, taking the first one, the challenges to the captive market. I mean, I think there is still a challenge from the sort of entrenched vested interests that you see everywhere where this is a policy that's being rolled out. That, I mean, eventually governments need to bite the bullet of kind of abandoning their traditional style of utility. Electricity transmission companies eventually, so it's going to take, it's 2026, I'm now thinking of, will be unbundled and then will be formally separated from the interests of the sort of the state-owned generating companies, and that's the key moment really when it can basically play that sort of independent sort of TSO role and allow allow corporate PPAs and captive projects to sell to all the sort of basically what always happens, as we've seen everywhere, is that the best companies, the ones with the best credit rating and the ones who work best will go immediately when they can and buy very cheap solar plus battery or whatever, or will have their own generation, and you can see from the net metering that's already going on that there's some quite substantial projects in the agricultural sector and elsewhere, very, very big net metering projects in some areas. And the challenge is that the government's got to continue to allow that to happen. I mean, that's the big challenge, I think, and and that requires some political determination.
I was going to say that I'm aware that our time on this is finite. So you're saying that there's some political issues, perhaps widening it out. I mean, in our report, we argued that such was the control of the political arena, not necessarily a healthy at all political control, but the political control that regime change wasn't on the agenda pending some black swan occasion. The Islamist opposition has effectively been destroyed for the moment, even though that sensibility remains extremely strong through Egyptian political culture. So where do you see, how do you typify the political structures within which this power industry works, where do you see the risk? And then leading on from that, what is the political economy of those risks? How do you see it in terms of financing, in terms of the economic and political interests? Are they aligned with foreign investors as they seem to be now? Will that remain?
Sure. Well, I think as you said, I think there isn't much point in wasting too much breath over the sort of possibility of regime change. I think it's very theoretical. But and I think a much more interesting question is for investors and people working in Egypt to think about how they are managing their relationship with the state and with the economy now, and how they're probably going to have to do that in the future. And I think there's a possibility that things are going to change in that arena, and people need people need to watch out and basically to be clear about what they're doing. The point here is that I think for a long time, and this isn't exclusive to Egypt at all, but you can see it very clearly there. For a long time, it's been possible to separate very clearly sort of an engagement with the sort of technocratic side of the government, with the absolutely excellent central bank and the Ministry of Finance, and indeed the Ministry of Electricity and renewable energy. I mean, technocratic, these are really good professional people, and you're dealing with them, and that's absolutely fine. And there's a whole other aspect, that very incredibly disagreeable element of the way that the country's governed, the police, the military, the human rights abuses, and that all just sits in a separate box that doesn't have to be touched. And of course there's what we're all trying to do, and I include us in that, as well. This isn't the whole energy industry of which we're a part, bringing cheap power to the people, enabling economic development. What better thing is there to do than that? And I think and this has been the rule up until now, and it's been a very good one. But I think the cordon sanitaire, if you like, which has divided these two spheres, is beginning to erode. One of the reasons for that is because in Egypt certainly there's the encroachment of the military into the economic sphere is beginning to blur the edges. Who are you dealing with, and what is your relationship with these people? There's and I think there's also a broader question, which I think everyone has to ask, which is to what extent the economic foundation on which the development is taking place now depends on getting rid of subsidies, which they've done an incredible job over there. It depends on the devaluation of the Egyptian pound back in 2016. These were very unpopular policies, but it's not their basic unpopularity which is the big issue. It's the fact that although in a more democratic country, things would work differently, but it's the fact that in order to suppress opposition to these policies, the Egyptian government is having to do some pretty bad things, frankly. And I think there's a danger that in the future, activists and opponents of the regime, they're going to wise up a bit to this, and they're going to start telling investors, you can't take the benefits of these difficult economic policies without paying some of taking some responsibility for the political environment which in which those policies are being enacted. So I think that's an important risk, and it doesn't mean don't invest in Egypt. I think what it means is that investors need to be talking to the Egyptians about this and explaining that there is a potential risk that needs to be addressed, so that development can continue.
It's a very good point. Thank you, Lauren, has put a link to the African Energy editorial that I mentioned earlier, where we explore. Well, I was acting as the mouthpiece of John Hamilton, as so often. John, we've got about 4 minutes left, which is not long. There was another actual question, possibly about captive systems from Albert and Ganga, but just before we do, on the whether overcapacity in power production was impacting on licensing and the permitting of captive systems. I think it shows we've had 2 questions on the C&I market, just how much interest there is around there. I'd like to ask you a quick question. What are the macroeconomic risks? You talked about the pound's devaluation back in 2016. And you look at the IMF reports, we're looking at at a macro level, a very strong performance. So where would you see the risks? And finally, just to wrap up, as we do come towards the end of our allotted time, what would your final conclusions be, apart from telling people to buy the report?
Well, on the macroeconomic risks, yes, they've done incredibly well based on some of these decisions they've taken and implemented. But I think one has to wonder what would happen if another big shock came along. If COVID doesn't go away for another year, if they can't get their tourism industry back up, if there's some terrible outrage, a bomb or something. Is there enough left in the tank to support another big shock? So that's a risk. But they've done well. I think the other thing is water. We haven't really spoken about that, but in 2025, some figures show that Egypt population is going to reach the threshold for water poverty set by the UN. This isn't just to do with GERD in Ethiopia, but that's a big issue. But they need desalination. They also need to fix the whole water system, but desalination needs power. So I think, some of those questions about captive power, some of those questions about sort of LNG, Egypt is going to need power and so this is another demand thing, which I think is going to be very important, and probably green power for water desalination. So my general conclusion is that I think Egypt's an incredibly exciting market. I think hopefully what we've shown in this talk is that you start with something which looks completely negative. There's massive overcapacity. You say, what a waste of time, we'll come back in 5 years' time. I don't think that's the right position to take to Egypt. I think you've got to look really hard and take the market to pieces and be a bit patient, because it's not easy, but there's opportunities for sure.
Thank you. I saw a final question coming in from Hagar Abdul Nadi, who's just asking for some thoughts, and I don't think we've got time, but it's a good way to finish on the blending of green hydrogen into Egypt's national gas grid. Well, of course, if you use gas to produce the hydrogen, you're going to have blue hydrogen, and if hydrogen is going to be to some degree an export play, and as it's been totally driven by the Germans, by EU green economy, as John made the point with exporting electricity, they're going to be wanting to see it's come from green circumstances. So probably you could produce hydrogen, you're going to find uses for it. But it does actually kind of round things off nicely, doesn't it, John, that in Egypt we are talking about a quite remarkable energy mix that will keep us talking and analysing for a very long time to come. It's an investment play with some angles that investors should think about.
It moves very quickly. That's why we had to completely rewrite the report a year after we first wrote it, because there's a lot happens in Egypt.
there's nothing like the insanity of producing reports with dates on it. Ladies and gentlemen out there, which I'm sure many of you know, it's an insane process. Things change, but that is change in itself is good. Can I thank everyone for participating with this? Can I thank my colleague Lauren Andrews for putting it together so well? And she said about contacting people, and you've got that on the chat. And above all, could I thank John, a Stakhanovite task in helping to put the report together, along with the live data team on the data, but a really good job. And you know, I think if we are highly critical sometimes about Egypt, that's because A, we try to treat it very seriously and understand it, and B, maybe it's because we love it a bit.
That's true.
That would be the case. So thank you, everyone. Last word, John.
Well, there's so much to talk about. Get in touch with us through Lauren or directly with us, because we've scratched the surface.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for scratching it with us, and everyone have a very good rest of the day.